Alright, good morning everybody. I am simply going to record this video to kind of make sure that we get this done quickly and there's no distractions and you can go back and watch it since we're not meeting in person. So the first unit we're covering in our statewide dual credit U.S. history class is Reconstruction, which is the idea of rebuilding the nation after the Civil War. For those of you who are aware of what the Civil War looked like, you have the northern states in blue, the southern states known as Confederacy in yellow, some green states there who couldn't decide which side they wanted to support. In other words, our nation was divided during the Civil War. So, what is Reconstruction exactly? Reconstruction could be defined as rebuilding something, but in U.S. history, it describes the attempt to rebuild the nation after the Civil War. Basically, from 1861 to 65, we fought a war, North versus South. The main idea behind all of this was slavery. Once the war was over and slavery was going to be done away with, how exactly would our nation handle bringing those two sides back together? Which brings us to our wonderful President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wanted to allow the southern states to rejoin the nation quickly and without further fighting. His idea was allow the South back in, unite the nation, and then we can handle our issues going forward. He did not want to stop the South from joining back quickly. Unfortunately, before he could get his plan rolling, he was assassinated. John Wilkes Booth snuck up behind him at the theater and ruined his night and ended his life. But ruining his night was also in the list. His successor was a president named Andrew Johnson, who was his vice president. He was only chosen because he was going to be a Southern man who could get him votes in the 1864 election, and because he, being from Tennessee, helped Tennessee jump right back into joining the United States when the war was over. With that said, he was a major supporter of Southern states' rights to create their own government, and he blocked many plans that were put into place to help the freedmen. So Southern states who didn't want to give African Americans their equality, they passed laws that restricted blacks' rights. And as president, you would hope that he would not allow that to happen. Unfortunately, he believed states could decide what they wanted to do on their own, and so he blocked a lot of Northerners' attempts to get rid of the laws that restricted black men's rights, black men and women who were newly freed. He also pardoned Southern leaders and allowed them to actually try to come back into Congress. He furthermore vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, which tried to give African Americans education and help after they were freed from slavery. He also blocked the Civil Rights Act and allowed black codes to be passed. Black codes were short-term laws in southern states which tried to return blacks to a state of slavery. Not actual slaves, but they were not allowed to testify on a jury, own a weapon, learn to read or write, and lots of other things. So unfortunately, Andrew Johnson did not do a good job as president of allowing African Americans to transition into life as citizens. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the country. But as I mentioned in the last slide, although blacks were free, Southerners passed laws known as black codes that kept them from gaining their equality. When blacks were able to use their newly granted rights, many Southerners intimidated them through white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Maybe they don't look exactly like you thought they would on the right, but many of the Ku Klux Klan members were former Confederate soldiers, and they would wear their regalia, which looked like Confederate soldiers. In fact, the first time, some of the first instances of the KKK intimidating blacks included them having that sheet over their head and telling the blacks that they were trying to scare, that they were ghosts of Confederate soldiers. But the main focus of this was not only did they pass laws to restrict blacks' rights, but when that wasn't enough, they also physically threatened them with violence and intimidated them so that they wouldn't practice their rights and they would stay scared and would not try to fight for their equality. Which brings us to Congress taking over. Since Andrew Johnson wasn't doing enough, Republican leaders believed that Andrew Johnson did not need to be in control of Reconstruction. So first they blocked those Southern congressmen and legislators from joining Congress. They even tried to get rid of Andrew Johnson as president. He only survived by one single vote. Now earlier this year, Donald Trump came to the Senate to be impeached, but he did not come nearly as close as Andrew Johnson did to getting kicked out. So once they get Andrew Johnson scared of standing in their way because of impeachment, they go ahead and begin passing laws and forcing the South to adopt their ideas that would treat blacks more kindly. They forced southern states, if they wanted to rejoin the U.S., they actually had to rewrite their state constitutions. And those constitutions would actually have to include things like the 13th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, which becomes the 14th Amendment. And they also, because they didn't trust the South to take care of African Americans, they divided the South into 5 military districts. So you can see here you have the South divided into 5 districts. For Tennessee, the reason why they're not in one of those 5 districts is because we rejoined the it rejoined the United States very quickly after the war ended. But for these other southern states, they held out, not wanting to accept these new laws which treated blacks as equal citizens. Now, what is great about military reconstruction is when the military was in the South, you probably envision African Americans being scared and not getting to vote. But when the military was down there, African Americans were actually able to have their rights protected. And as you can see on the right part of this screen, African Americans were able to vote. So, with the security that the military granted them from Northern congressmen, they are able to go out and vote. They have the 14th Amendment passed, which promised them equal rights and protection of those rights by the federal government. In other words, if southern states tried to pass any more black codes, they would be blocked. And if anyone tried to force those black codes on them or force them to give up their rights, African Americans could look to the military and the federal government to protect them from those southern states. Then you also have the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was the guarantee of the right to vote to all men, regardless of race and previous condition of servitude. The idea being now all men, regardless of what their background is and their race, have the right to vote. So these two men in this picture are Hiram Revels and Blanche Gay Bruce, which is awesome because these two men are two of the very first African American congressmen. One was a senator, one being a servant in the House of Representatives. So with that said, you can see that blacks actually were able to, and African Americans, even though they had been slaves, they are now leaders. They are elected. So what happens in the next 40, 50, 60 years? How did African Americans go from having congressmen to forcing Martin Luther King Jr. nearly a century later in the 1960s? Why would he need to march and protest and give his speeches and fight so hard for African Americans' rights if all these rights were granted to them during the Reconstruction period? Well, that comes down to the end of Reconstruction. In 1876, Southern states with a new president named Rutherford B. Hayes. He allows them to end Reconstruction. He pulls the military out, and Southern states begin passing laws that will later become known as Jim Crow laws. These Jim Crow laws included many acts that stopped them from being able to practice their rights, including literacy tests. If African American wanted to vote, they had to take a bias reading or writing test. If a white person applied, they would have a very simple test they would have to pass, if they had to take one at all. But if an African American man tried to vote, they would give him an extremely hard test. The grading would be horribly unfair, and that was one way that they stopped blacks from being able to vote. Then you have poll taxes. In order to vote, you had to pay a hefty tax. Now, for many African Americans who had just been released from slavery, they did not have the extra income to pay just to vote. They needed to support their families and make their way in life. So these taxes were another deterrent or way of stopping African Americans from practicing their rights. And then for whites who maybe they were afraid they couldn't pass the literacy test, or maybe they didn't have the money to pay the poll taxes. So many southern states passed something called the grandfather clause that said if your grandfather could vote before 1865, you were exempt from poll taxes and tests. Well, no whites were enslaved before 1865, so every white in those states would be exempt from paying those taxes or taking that test. But as you may have easily guessed, African Americans' grandfathers were probably slaves, and so they would have to take that test and pay that tax. And then finally, you have lynching. Lynching is hanging without a trial. This was a way that terrorist groups like the KKK and other white supremacists were able to terrify blacks into basically not practicing their rights. Should an African American try to register to vote or to rally others around the idea of voting, they would accuse him of a crime, talking to a white woman, something violent, and a mob would come grab them and hang them in a public square. Now, if you were another African American and you saw that happening to someone who just wanted to vote, would you think it was worth your life to try to vote or get your friends to vote? Probably not. And so that's why lynching became a very popular way of stopping African Americans from practicing their rights. So now we go on to this guy named Homer Plessy. Now, from this picture, you may think that he is a white man, but he is actually 1/8 black. And so, according to Southern law, technically, he is an African American. So that brings us to these Jim Crow laws segregating public facilities. So where does Homer Plessy play in this? Well, with the southern states being able to separate whites and blacks, men like Homer Plessy decided to fight against it. And so Homer Plessy, despite being only 1/8 black, he is forced to sit on the wrong train car, And so he decides to sue to try to get rid of that segregation. Unfortunately for Homer Plessy and all African Americans around our country, this Supreme Court case, Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, the person who owned the train company, this Supreme Court case decides that not only was segregation legal, as long as both races were provided equal facilities and opportunities, it was protected by the Supreme Court and the federal government. So this idea that you could keep the races separate as long as they were treated equal becomes kind of the term that everyone applies to segregation and why it was allowed. Hey, everybody has transportation, everybody has schooling. Yes, blacks have their own school and whites have their own school, but hey, that's equal opportunity. As you may have guessed, over time, African Americans would have less resources, would be forced into basically suffering in a second class status because white groups would get all of the financing and all the support, and blacks would be left behind. So, this separate but equal idea really harms African Americans, so the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, really puts them behind. Until 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education finally undoes this separate but equal doctrine. And so that brings us to our last slide, which is some African Americans said, you know what, it is just not worth it to live in the South. And so many of them decided to move to other areas. Now, not in urban areas, not areas like New York City or Detroit. Rather, a lot of them moved to try to become farmers. After all, that was the skill that many of them had developed, and they knew they were good at it. And so Pap Singleton is one specific figure, and he founds a little community at Dunlap, Kansas. And Pap Singleton, they call themselves, the group that followed him, the Exodusters. Now, if you followed the Bible, Exodus is when the Jews or the Israelites leave Egypt out of slavery, right? And they go to the Promised Land. Well, that's the same idea for African Americans here. If they could make it to Kansas, where there was nothing but open land and no segregation and not centuries of enslavement, they could make their own start with their own farms in their own African American communities where they would happily be treated equally. This is a picture of one of the churches built in one of those African American communities. And as you can see, they happily went out west and were treated a lot better because they were surrounded by people like them who cared about them. So this is the first half of our Reconstruction lesson. We'll have a little bit more to do, but this just gives you the general idea of how the North and South handled it. The South tried to continue to restrict blacks through black codes and through Jim Crow laws. For a while, African Americans were able to practice their rights. They get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the military was sent to protect them. They're even able to elect congressmen. Unfortunately, once the military was pulled out, however, beginning with the 1876 election, that led to African Americans being left behind with Jim Crow laws restricting their rights, ending their right to vote, and eventually seeing them segregated and treated as second-class citizens. So that is it for this lesson. We'll continue with Reconstruction next day. Have a great one.